So my name is Tom DeFanti. I grew up in New York City, grew up in Queens, and went to Queens College, Stuyvesant High School before that. Everybody in New York knows what Stuyvesant is. And then to Ohio State University. Graduated from there, PhD 50 years ago today, believe it or not.
Wow. Well, happy anniversary. And let us know who you studied under.
So my PhD advisor is named Lee White, and he more or less guided me, but the person I worked with most closely for my actual PhD dissertation was Charles Surrey, Chuck Surrey, who was very famous. And Chuck had managed to get a big grant from NSF, a big grant at that time, to do what he called real-time film animation, which became my dissertation topic. And because we were working with a vector general display, and it was a real-time device. And so I used a PDP 1145 to essentially play the thing as a visual musical instrument. And that was unusual because everybody else was doing batch computing. And even to this day, things like the Linux operating systems aren't really real-time operating systems. You know, they go off and do things whenever they feel like it and leave you hanging, and you just wait. And we couldn't do that because we wanted to actually point TV cameras at the screen and be able to record things in a time when editing television was only for the TV stations. And so we had to do kind of one-hit wonders, you know, had to do a complete shot without interruption or glitches. So that was Ohio State. Then I went to the University of Illinois, Chicago in 1973 and stayed there until 2004. And then I came to the University of California, San Diego in 2004 and am still here working full-time. My interest from the beginning was really in this real-time computer graphics, and the people in film animation called real-time animation an oxymoron, because animation for them was cell animation, frame by frame animation, no matter how you created it. I wanted to do a thing that was much more like music, like playing an instrument, you know, and with the kind of timing and other sorts of controls that you have in music. This was unusual, but it served me well. When I went to University of Illinois Chicago, I was hired under essentially an educational technology grant. I was hired in the chemistry department originally because they didn't have a computer science department, but they did have the vector general display, and they wanted me to create educational materials for teaching chemistry, which I did for a few years until the CS department was formed. And I met Dan Sandine there, and also other notable characters like Ted Nelson at that point. And we started working on doing visualizations together. Dan and I still work together. We're still in contact constantly, and it's been a great life, career. Dan was the one who brought the analog coloring device to our early work before we were able to do color on computer graphics directly with the frame buffers. And then it was a struggle, of course, to make the frame buffers responsive and do anything on the frame buffers in real time. Spent a lot of time doing assembly language code to get every last ounce out of these 2 megahertz computers. When we think about they're, 10,000 times faster now, About the same time, I was doing SIGGRAPH conferences and became part of the SIGGRAPH executive committee. We started working with Bally Midway, which is a video game company in Chicago. At that point, Bally and Atari were using more RAM and ROM in computers than the rest of the entire industry put together. And they were getting more quarters in their video games than the entire movie industry was, or commercial television was generating in ad revenue. So it was a big deal. And we were we were the Skunk Works. It was kind of cool, for Bally Midway. And we generated chips, which were essentially, now we call them GPUs. We've been doing, and so Vector General actually had a graphics processing unit. That's essentially what it was, a sort of a digital analog graphics processing unit. So I've had a long experience with GPUs. This led me on a variety of paths. A major one was I got involved with Larry Smarr on the Supercomputer Center in Urbana. and UIUC, and he had just gotten a huge, unbelievably huge grant to build supercomputers with other places around the country, because the only scientists at that point in the mid-'80s that had access to supercomputers were working at defense laboratories and DOE laboratories. Larry wanted to do his research in cosmology and astrophysics. So he got this huge grant, and in reasons that neither of us have ever understood, we got along really well. We're still friends. I worked with him now for almost, it's not quite 40 years, since 1986. Something like that. Donna Cox was the one who actually got us together. Donna had been a colleague of ours when she was at the University of Wisconsin, and she went down to Urbana and decided that Larry and Dan Sandine and I had to meet. And we thought this was very improbable, but it turned out to be a many decade collaboration. It's also the reason I came here in 2004. Larry was spectacularly given charge of a $100 million operation here at UC San Diego. And he hired me to design and build the media suites for HD TV and virtual reality. We did a big show called Supercomputing 95. Now, this is kind of in parallel to the SIGGRAPH conferences. But the point of Supercomputing 95 was to bring the nation's networks together. So this was out of the Al Gore part of the White House, and Tom Khalil, who pushed this. And I was given the job of making it happen. And I had some very strong hands behind me, but we had to get AT&T and MCI and Sprint to work together, which was hard.
Before we move on, you just give us a little bit about what it was like working with Larry Cuba, working on Star Wars.
Okay, so Larry first showed up as a film animator. He had been going around and sort of embedding him in various groups. And he would come and he would stay in my basement in Oak Park, Illinois, and on the waterbed, and work at night times on the computer when he wouldn't be in anybody's way, because it really was a single user computer. He created some etudes, I suppose you'd call them. When the call came out for the special effects, and this is, from Lucas, they wanted something to use as digital effects in the first Star Wars movie. We read the script and said, oh, this is kind of interesting. It's sort of a comic book type thing. It's nice, and I said, and Larry said, yeah, but he did American Graffiti. He's really good, We got permission from the university to rent time, essentially to Larry, who was independent contractor. It looked like what they thought people would think computer generated output would look like. So we got this small contract to do these, 45 seconds worth of material or whatever it turned out to be. Larry had to build a model of the Death Star, and we had to make the tools for him to do that. Larry Lesky built the controller to have the Mitchell camera kicked off frame at a time. I didn't know how to do that. Larry did, and both Larrys knew how to do this. So they created the frame at a time capture. Now, we had no idea, of course, that this was going to be a big deal. The fun thing about that was I went to the premiere in the Esquire Theater in Chicago with my students of Star Wars. And it gets to that point in the movie, the briefing room scene, the professor saying, well, here's what you do. You get down here and you hit the thing in its hole and blow it up. And the audience went wild, and I turned to the person I was with and I said, they like our effect. And she says, no, stupid, it's the turning point of the movie. We were pretty far out there, trying to do musical instruments with computers in a computer science department. And I was up for tenure. This was the one thing that people understood. There were no computer graphics journals at that point. To get tenure, you're supposed to have a pile of journal articles, right? And there weren't any journals. We had to start them, right? Or SIGGRAPH had to start them. And my senior faculty members took a chance on me and said, well, let's give this guy a shot, Otherwise, we'll have to say there can never be a new field. Department head Bruce McCormick, who was also my co-chair, that we were equal co-chairs for the SIGGRAPH 79 conference, and also wrote later on the visualization report with Maxine Brown, which put the word visualization in everybody's vocabulary, even though we stole it from L.D. Ray Smith. and who was using it to mean something else. He meant using it to mean voxels at that point. But we wanted to sort of heal the gap between pattern recognition, image processing, and computer graphics, which were two sides essentially of the same thing, but had very, very different groups. And we chose a word that both groups would be happy with. If you want to do really something hard, get your boss involved as your partner, because then you will be able to do it.
I guess if your boss is involved, then funding becomes a non-issue.
Well, at least your state funding, yeah, right. And so he and I and Maxine Brown, she's SIGGRAPH YouTube chair, she did what was the first truly major equipment show in '79. Before that, they were side pieces, and this was the first time we had our own space in an exhibit hall in '79. And so Maxine ran that with the help of her other wonderful characters like Jim George and Steve Levine.
You started the SIGGRAPH Video Review, right?
I did, in fact, yes, and ran that for decades. And the way I got into SIGGRAPH was in the first conference, which is in Boulder, Colorado in '74. Dan Sandine and Ted Nelson and I presented the second paper. The first paper was Ed Catmull and Fred Park. They were showing the work they had done at Utah. We did the second paper and about our real-time graphics, and they were showing their face and their hand animation, which you probably remember in black and white.
And also from the movie Looker a few years later.
Right. Dan and I and Ted got in this Plymouth station wagon, belonged to the university, brought a couple of 3/4-inch video decks and monitors and stuff, and they rented a black and white projector for us. Couldn't get a color projector, video projector at that point. We drove across, from Chicago to Boulder, Colorado with this gear. We had very carefully queued up the tapes because we didn't yet own video editing equipment. So we had all these little bits we wanted to show queued up on 3/4-inch tape. And we had 2 tape decks and a thing we could switch between them. And we had everything all queued up in a stack the night before, and they had hired a guard to watch all of this expensive equipment. And the guard decided to watch videotapes.
Oh, no.
So they're all miscued. And so we get up and it switches over from Fred and Ed, who had their piece on 60mm film, and this, of course, is the kind of tech that I used in elementary school. And that was, of course, very smooth. And then it comes to us and we realize in a panic that the tapes are all miscued. So Dan is queuing tapes on one machine, I'm queuing tapes on the other machine, and Ted is explaining how wonderful it all is, right? And then we get a piece clear up, we show it, and then Ted talks some more, and then we show it again, and it was great. And afterwards, people came and said, that was the most amazing performance. How long did you guys have to rehearse? That was pretty spectacular. So that was '74. '77 was the next time I really got heavily involved with Jim George and Steve Levine, and it was the one in San Jose. And they gave me a big budget to run what was then called the Film and Video Show. And we rented a GE light valve projector, and that was the first time the III people showed their rotating Mercedes-Benz thing and so on. It just blew everybody away. The Juggler was later. Juggler was, I think, '79. That was really kind of the first SIGGRAPH that I think knocked people out because of the fact that they saw things on the screens that they just didn't see at home, and there was nobody covered the stuff on TV. It wasn't like you could. It took years before lumberyards had computer graphics commercials. This was sort of the beginning of the very rapid growth of the SIGGRAPH conferences. I think it was '77, and then '78 we went to Atlanta, and then '79 Chicago was the one that I was co-chair with Bruce McCormick. This is the one that people started coming to see what they wanted and whom they wanted to invest in. Within a couple of years, the limousines were circling the convention center as the investment moguls were coming to see what they should invest in. As SIGGRAPH went from being a special interest group of the ACM and one of 27 of them, and we had one vote on the ACM Council. So we were 125th of 127th of the power structure. Yet we were spending more on orange juice than the ACM National Conference at that point. By the point that SIGGRAPH 85 rolled around at the end of my tenure as the SIGGRAPH chair, we were spending more on buses and any other number of categories than our current organization was spending. We were very proud of that. Of course, that made them very worried. And who was I? I guess I was in my 30s then, but still, who was I to be in a position to, affect the finances of ACM as much, because they were actually responsible for us. Fortunately, we were good, and it was a time when things were growing well. We had 4 tutorials. Mike Deering, who is a lifelong friend still, ran the tutorials. And there was an introductory one, and then a CAD one, and a rendering one, and image processing probably. Because that year we were joint with the Pattern Recognition and Image Processing Conference. Because that was really Bruce McCormick's interest, was the image processing, pattern recognition area, which now is what we call AI and machine learning, right? We had a guy from the White House who was pushing computer graphics, who literally was a politician from the White House who gave an opening talk. And it was a big honor for us to get in there. The film and video show, of course, was extraordinary. The first SIGGRAPH video review out of the 1980 content, not out of the 79 content. I decided that I want to turn SIGGRAPH into the conference that people would come to if they only got to go to one conference a year, that it would be the party, and that this would involve not only computer graphics technical people, but the users and the artists and the scientists who were using computer graphics. And this wound up getting a lot of women involved in computer graphics. And that was important because that wasn't the case in the rest of computing, right? In areas like networking, there's very few women, more now than there used to be. So this was a thing that eventually turned into a big part of SIGGRAPH, having the art and science and the cross-pollination between the two fields, and having, you can't have a party unless you've got people who are partying. This was my explicit goal in 1979, to create a thing that people would definitely come to the next one for, which they did, and after and after and after. In the early 90s, so roughly 30 years ago, Dan Sandine and I started working heavily in the virtual reality area. We didn't much like the head-mounted displays because they're so low res and the response time was so bad, you get sick. So we started doing these projection-based virtual reality systems called caves. And we had the first one in public showing at SIGGRAPH 92. That was a real game changer. And we got a lot of funding based on that for the next couple of decades. And the thing that I liked about it was that after this detour we did into non-real-time frame buffer computer graphics, but then with the virtual reality we had to get back to the real-time piece of it. You can't do virtual reality frame at a time. It has to keep up with you, and boy does it have to do it right. I mean, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to go off and check my disks, so we had to build everything and even bypass the Unix operating system to get everything to be real time. The chief problem was that it was awfully expensive, and the real expensive part of it originally was the Silicon Graphics computers that we needed to run the walls. And there was basically $1 million worth of those in 1992 money to run a cave. There was only one type of a projector to use. It had low enough latency in the green tube to be able to do things in real time. Well, we were running 90 hertz, I guess. With higher latency, the left and right eye would smear together. And so that didn't work. So we were able to find these 2 projectors that had special phosphors. Eventually, we moved to projectors that JVC built for us. Greg Daw designed with people at JVC, and they did fairly well in their own flight simulator business using these short throw, high-speed HD projectors, or 2K as we called it then. And then, of course, the hardware got faster, better, and way cheaper. So now the expense for a cave is in the screens, not in the computers, right? Our current dark cave, or sun cave rather, has 70 GPUs and 70 screens and half a gigapixel resolution. So it actually exceeds human visual acuity. The sun cave still works, and we use it when nobody is actually staring at the screens. We actually use it as a 70 GPU machine learning computer. SIGGRAPH completely made my career. I mean, there's no question about it. And even what I'm doing now, which is building a planetary scale computer with volunteers, which we call Nautilus, and is John Graham's creation, but is being embraced by people all over the world using high-speed networks. This all came out of because people wanted to see things. You know, all of the reason why people want more memory in their computer is to hold pictures or movies or something, right? It's not to hold words. If we only wanted to hold words, we'd probably still be on teletypes. SIGGRAPH had its pulse on it. And we had, with the people we were working with, you know, and the, on one end, the Elder Ray Smiths and Ed Catmull's, who, you know, essentially wound up making it so you can't see a movie that doesn't have CGI in it, to everything else in our lives, to all everything that you can, that's manufactured is designed with, you know, computer graphics, right? Until they don't need us anymore, and then it will be computer graphics. It'll just be machine learning, you know, AI directly. But in any event, SIGGRAPH really led to all of that. It certainly was my career, my 50-year career, as of now, and you know, that's been great. You know, I gave everything I had to it, and it gave everything back.